Hi everyone and welcome to this lecture. My name is Tim Jones and I work for an organisation based in the UK called Jubilee Debt Campaign. Jubilee Debt Campaign works to campaign for international debt justice, for debt cancellation and for measures to make lending more responsible to try to prevent debt crises from happening. And in the lecture today, we're going to look at some of the international campaigning for debt justice and then some related issues as well. So first of all, I'll share my PowerPoint presentation with you. So the formal title of the lecture is Civic Engagement and Campaigning for Debt Justice, International Advocacy. And what we will cover in the lecture. First of all, we'll look at the campaign around the millennium for a debt jubilee for international debt cancellation. Then some of what's happened since with debt and campaigns against IMF bailouts and for greater transparency in lending. Then the campaign for debt cancellation in response to the coronavirus crisis. And then finally, some issues of debt data and debt sustainability. So to put the campaign around the millennium into context, I know you'll have covered a lot of this already, but just to set the context, in the 1980s, a widespread debt crisis began across much of the global south. So this was had been a big boom in lending in the 1970s, and then at the start of the 1980s, commodity prices fell, which is the main export earning for many countries in the global south, and interest rates rose on the debt. The US put up interest rates, and so income fell at the same time as the cost of paying the debt increased. And that caused a widespread debt crisis. Many countries were left not able to pay their debts. And if they the debts had not been paid, that would have put into financial trouble many banks in the US, in the UK, Japan. And so Western countries, powers wanted to stop that from happening. So their response instead was to do a bailout. So the IMF and then the World Bank lent more money, which was then used to keep paying the interest on the debt, whilst at the same time demanding that countries implement radical free market economic policies. So they cut government spending, liberalize trade, deregulate the economy, and wide-scale privatization. Now, the IMF and World Bank argued that those policies would lead to economic growth, and so countries would therefore be able to pay the debt in the future. But that isn't what happened. Across the 1980s and the 1990s. There was a widespread recession and then economic stagnation, especially in Africa and Latin America. And this meant that the debt just carried on increasing. So this graph shows the debt, external debt, so that's debt owed to other countries, as a percentage of GDP from starting at 1970 across the global south. So it starts to rise in the 1970s. And then the debt crisis begins in the 1980s. But as these policies are introduced, the debt keeps on increasing because economies fell and stagnated, currencies devalued against the dollar. And so by the year 2000, the debt was higher than it had ever been. Now, throughout this time, there are obviously campaigns, protests in countries against what was happening. And against these policies in the global south. And there are also some solidarity campaigns in the global north calling for debts to be cancelled. But then these came together in some sense in a global movement in the late 1990s. So there was the idea to use the concept of a jubilee to call for debts to be cancelled. So the word jubilee comes from the the Jewish scriptures, which is the Old Testament of the Christian Bible, and the word means a celebration. But it's a celebration of when debts are cancelled and when slaves are freed. And so the idea campaigners had was to call for a jubilee for the year 2000 as a way of celebrating the turn of the millennium, and so saying that debts of the 52 countries should be cancelled. And by using this concept and linking it to this big moment of the millennium, it generated widespread interest and support across many countries in both the global north and the global south. And this was seen in a succession of campaign moments that took place over the years, both before the year 2000 and after. So overall, across the campaign, it's thought that 21 million people around the world signed the petition calling for debt cancellation as a way of celebrating the millennium. There were a series of protests that followed the self-appointed world leaders around. So these tended to happen at G7 summits, which is a group of a few European countries in the US and Canada. And those countries were important because between them, they have the votes in the IMF and World Bank to determine what the IMF and World Bank do. So in 1998, there was a protest of 80,000 people in Birmingham in the UK, where the G7 leaders met. That was followed by protests in Cologne in Germany and Genoa in Italy. I remember being at a protest in Prague in the Czech Republic when the IMF and World Bank met there. And then when the G7 came back to the UK in 2005 in Edinburgh, there was a protest of 250,000 people. So these protests followed the G7 and the IMF and World Bank around over these years, and they were backed by this widespread petition from people across the world, from global north and global south, even though the meetings tended to be in countries in the global north. And then in individual countries, there was often much more detailed lobbying of political figures to try and get them on side with the campaign. The members of parliament in the UK got very used to being ordinary people who knew lots of detail about debt and the IMF and World Bank and lobbying them. The UK's finance minister at the time, Gordon Brown, tells a story of how he was receiving letters from his mum demanding debts were cancelled and with lots of detail, and so that helped hit home to him. And almost, I mean, this is debatable how important it was in the campaign, but as the campaign became popular, then various celebrities became attached themselves to the campaign as well. So the singer Bono from U2 is probably the most famous of these, who joined in with the campaign and calling for debt cancellation, which I guess did help the campaign reach more people around the world, although they came to the campaign once it was already big, rather than them helping to make it big. Now, there were various different approaches that people took to their messaging through the campaign, which reflected both political positions and the targets that people felt that they could reach. So in the global north especially, there were some questionable ways in which the campaign was communicated, I would say, based on charity. So often a lot of the messages were based on cancel the debt because these countries, these people are poor, and that did very little to explain to people why countries were in debt in the first place, what the issues of injustice were that lay behind the debt crisis. But some campaigns did appeal to that injustice, more a framing of cancel the debt because the loans should never have been lent, that exposed how loans had been given in the benefit of the Western world to bail out Western banks, to support arms deals, to prop up various dictators who were on the side of the West during the Cold War. And so some campaigners did use those messages. Then there was also a distinction that for northern campaigners, so campaigners in the global north, something like me in the UK, it's natural to focus on our governments and leaders, on the G7, on international institutions. So focus on them and calling for them to cancel the debt. Jubilee South was formed collection of organisations in the global south with the main message of we don't owe, we won't pay. And so that was trying to both challenge the charity narrative that debt cancellation isn't about charity, this debt should never be owed in the first place, but also challenge who has the ownership over this issue. The global south governments could just refuse to pay. You don't need to appeal to the those in power who've caused the crisis in the first place, the G7, the IMF and World Bank. That global south governments could themselves declare we don't owe, we won't pay, and collectively stop paying the debt. So there were these wide variety of messages, wide variety of targets, but it all did contribute to what felt like a widespread global campaign that genuinely put pressure on leaders across the world that something needed to be done about this. And so something was done, and it wasn't what was being called for. So either the call for the cancellation of the debt of 52 countries or the call for countries to collectively en masse stop paying, neither of those things happened. What did happen was the G7 got the IMF and World Bank to create a scheme for reducing debts, which involves some debt cancellation. This began actually in the late 1990s, and it allowed just the most impoverished countries to qualify for debt cancellation if they implemented even more IMF and World Bank economic policies. And that cancellation initially just reduced debt to what the IMF and World Bank regarded was a sustainable level. So say the debt was already up here, and they decided there was a certain amount that was sustainable, and so it would reduce the debt down to there, whatever the starting point was. Eventually, over quite a long period, by 2005 that was changed, so there was a much more debt cancellation. And so after 2005 it depended on the country, but for countries qualifying for this scheme they tended to get around 80% of their debt cancelled, but still they had to qualify and implement these conditions. So generally it was between the year 2000 and 2012 that different countries went through this process. So it was both, wasn't what campaigners had called for. Some of what was done enhanced the power of the IMF and World Bank by saying that countries had to implement even more of their policies. And also it took a long time both to get these changes. So it was a big change was in 2005 when there was much more debt relief agreed, but also for individual countries to get through this scheme. But if they did, there was a genuinely large amount of debt was cancelled as a result. And across the 36 countries that have now gone through the scheme, they had around $130 billion of debt cancelled. Another change through this time was actually that commodity prices, which had been low all the way through, started to increase. And so that helped both some of these countries out and others that didn't qualify for the debt cancellation in the first place if they were commodity exporters. And that combined with when the global financial crisis hit in 2008, 2009, interest rates in the global north were cut to really low levels. And so speculators started looking out to elsewhere in the world where they could lend more money. So you both had a lot more countries that had higher economic growth because of commodity prices being higher, and lower debts, partly because of debt cancellation, and interest rates being low. And so this all led to a new boom in lending taking place, very similar to what had happened back in the 1970s before the previous crisis. At Jubilee Debt Campaign, we particularly track how much governments are spending on debt payments as a percentage of their government revenue. And this graph shows how those payments fell through the 2000s, through this period of debt cancellation, but that since 2010, they have been growing again following this boom in lending, and then some of the economic changes that have followed. So the campaign for debt cancellation, the Jubilee campaign, another main failure or thing it didn't achieve was getting any structural changes to how debt worked. So it managed to get some one-off debt cancellation, but it didn't get more widespread changes to prevent these debt crises from happening. So in more recent years, at Jubilee Debt Campaign, we've been trying to raise awareness of the threat of these new debt crises recurring. And then there's a couple of areas where we have been pushing for specific changes. In the context where we don't have or haven't had a large widespread global campaign in the same way, there's been over until this year a lot less interest in debt amongst international NGOs, amongst campaigners, and so we've not been able to have that widespread global campaign that existed before. So we focused on some specific changes. One of those has been to try to get more transparency around debt so that citizens, media, parliamentarians can hold lenders and government more to account over how loans are used. This follows particular scandals in Mozambique, which I think you'll have heard about, and in the Republic of Congo, where loans were given in secret. And so we've had some targeted campaign, which so far has led to some new voluntary rules for private lenders to make loan disclosure, but we're still pushing to try and get something far more widespread. And then as debt crises have re-emerged in countries, we've seen the same thing happen as in the 1980s and 1990s. The standard response is for the IMF to lend more money, which bails out the reckless lenders. And this is problematic for various reasons. One is it maintains the debt crisis in the country because the debt isn't reduced. It means the IMF puts more focus on cutting government spending, and so the costs of the crisis falling on the population in the country rather than those who've lent the money in the first place. And it also incentivizes lenders to keep acting recklessly in the future because they know that the IMF will pay them off if the debts can't be paid. Now, obviously then at the start of this year, the coronavirus crisis began. And so with international allies, we acted quickly in March to start a campaign calling for immediate debt payment cancellation because of the huge economic impact of the crisis and the need for countries to have the money to spend on healthcare. In April, we launched an international statement from over 250 organisations calling for debt payment cancellation. And that's involved a diversity of organisations, from large international NGOs like Save the Children and Oxfam to many active and grassroots national organisations in countries in both the global north and global south. And there are many more organisations keep getting in touch with us who want to be involved. One of the problems we've had so far is there has not been this international coordination of the campaigning that we have we ideally need, and this largely comes from the fact that there hasn't been so much work on debt for the last 10 years, that some of the structures that we needed in place weren't there to respond in certain regions and countries. So we hope to get that increased, but it is taking time. Now, in response to the launch of this campaign, alongside a few other things that happened, in particular, many governments in the global south spoke out early in the crisis on the need for debt payment suspensions or cancellations. And so those efforts collectively led to the G20 group of countries have launched a debt service suspension initiative. So this allows for countries to have their debt payments suspended to other governments for this year, and it will probably be extended into next year. Those payments aren't cancelled, so they then come due to be paid in a couple of years' time. And the debts owed to the private sector, which are the highest interest debts, and debts owed to multilateral institutions aren't covered. So it is quite a limited scheme, but it is something that has happened that we've now been critiquing to try and get it built on, so it does bring in other debts and does move towards actual debt payment cancellation, not just suspension. Now, moving towards the end of the lecture, I was also asked to cover a few issues around debt sustainability and debt data, so I'm going to move on to those now. The phrase debt sustainability is widely used, but I think very often very little understood as to what it could mean and what different people mean by it. And I'm going to talk through three different definitions of debt sustainability. The first one is, I think, the one that gets used the most, but that is the most superficial and wrong. And this looks at a government debt as being sustainable depending on how much government debt there is as a percentage of GDP. You often see this reported in media, and governments talk about debt being sustainable if it's less than 60% of GDP or 80%. Why I think this is so problematic is that how much your government debt is as a percentage of GDP is largely meaningless. Because that figure takes no account of some key things. It doesn't take account of how much government revenue country is collecting. So whatever your size of GDP is, some countries collect just 10% of GDP as government revenue in tax, some are up to 60%. So that makes a huge difference as to how much money the government actually has to pay debts. It has no information on the interest rate on the debt, who the debt is owed to, whether it's to people in the same country or to people elsewhere in the world, and when it is due to be paid. So to show this as an example, Japan is the country actually which has the largest government debt as a percentage of GDP in the world, 238%. But it gets a reasonable amount of government revenue as a percentage of GDP, so it's got reasonable revenue, and it pays hardly any interest on the debt that people lend to it Japan at almost 0% interest. And the main reason they do that is that the main lenders to the Japanese government are people in Japan, Japanese savers. So most of Japan's debt is owed internally, it's not owed to people elsewhere in the world. And so Japan doesn't have a government debt problem, despite having what looks like this very large amount of debt that is owed. And I contrast that with Ghana, in this table, has the lowest government debt as a percentage of GDP, but it also has far lower government revenue as a percentage of GDP with which to pay the debt. And most of its debt is owed to people elsewhere in the world, and it is those lenders charge a really high interest rate on the debt. Before the coronavirus crisis began, they were charging 8% interest rate, which means that they've been making far bit more in debt payments. So Ghana is spending 39% of government revenue on external debt payments, compared to just 1% in Japan. So that's why I think government debt as a percentage of GDP should just be ignored when we look at debt sustainability. What the IMF do when they talk about debt sustainability is that a debt is sustainable when it cannot be paid. And this is really problematic because it means as long as the debt is being paid, it's sustainable no matter what the cost is. For example, to health services, to education, to public services of the debt carry on being paid. In some cases, many cases, it's actually worse if the debt is being paid because of the cost on the country than if it's not being paid, if the country just stopped paying. So the IMF's definition is largely circular, that your debt is sustainable as long as it is being paid, and often the IMF will lend more money so that you can keep paying the debt. For some low-income and middle-income countries, they do have a debt risk rating system, which classifies countries as at low, moderate, or high risk of not paying their debts, or as the debt being unsustainable. But you only ever move to unsustainable if you stop paying, otherwise you just stay at high risk. But that only applies to a few countries, and it doesn't cover Angola. I'm going to, in a minute, show you some of this information on a website that Jubilee Debt Campaign runs. So then finally, what we would say debt sustainability is that debt is unsustainable when payments undermine a country's economy and or the ability of its governments to protect the basic economic and social rights of its citizens. So it's the impact of the debt that matters, whether it is being paid or not. So our research, I mean, there's clearly no magic number as to how much debt is therefore sustainable, because it is very based on the country context, but we found that public spending tends to be falling when debt payments are over 15% of government revenue. So that is a general line that we use as an indicator. It also really matters at a micro level what the loan is being spent on. So whatever the payments generated by a loan, if a loan is wasted or not well spent, then that debt is unsustainable. It's left the country in a worse financial position. And even if there's a high interest rate on the loan, if the loan is really well invested, so that the loan can be repaid with more left over, then it could still be sustainable. So that is another way of thinking about debt sustainability. I think I have 1 minute left, but so in that minute, I'm just going to share the Jubilee Debt Campaign website. So this is our debt data portal. And on this, we have both our risk analysis of country debt situations, the IMF risk analysis, and then various debt figures. So do go and have a look and see what is of interest on this debt website. So you have a map here that shows our analysis of the debt situation of the country. So here, Angola, based on various figures we class as being in debt crisis. then you can see what the IMS risk analysis is, but the main thing you'll notice from this map is that most countries are not given a risk rating by the IMF. And then this key figure, I think if there are lots of debt figures that are important, but we regard this as the most important one: government debt payments that leave the country as a proportion of government revenue. And Angola has one of the highest rates of those in the world. But there are many countries at the moment in red on this map that are spending over 20% of government revenue on debt payments that leave the country. So I've used up all my time, but just to finish, to say that so I've just had a baby daughter, and so I'm going to be on paternity leave on the day of your actual when you're watching this lecture and the questions and answers. So it's going to be my colleague, our director, Sarah Jane Clifton, who will be with you that day. I'm sorry I won't be with you, but I'll just put up on the final screen. So there's my email address, tim@jubileedebt.org.uk. So do get in touch if you have any questions, and thank you for listening.